going to start out with Spark Talk presenter Sunil Johal, Policy Director at the Mowat Centre in the University of Toronto. Sunil will provide an overview of the sharing economy, how we define it, how stakeholders from policymakers to entrepreneurs are responding to it, and its potential opportunity for social and economic transformation. Sunil often speaks on technology and policy issues and oversees the research agenda at the Mowat Centre, an independent public policy think tank located at the School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Toronto. And Sunil is joining us from Toronto. Welcome, Sunil.
Hello to everybody in Toronto. Hello to everybody in Vancouver. I'm sorry I couldn't make it out there. Unfortunately, I had a prior commitment. I'm actually talking about driverless cars with the Ontario government today. So the sharing economy in some ways is actually yesterday's news. We're moving on to the future, kind of very Jetsons-like as we move forward. So as Heather mentioned, I work at the Mowat Centre at the University of Toronto. The Mowat Centre is an independent public policy think tank. There's two main streams of research we undertake. One is in relation to intergovernmental affairs topics. So how does Ontario get treated by the federal government? I'll save you reading 50 reports and tell you we don't get treated very fairly, so you're welcome. I just saved you several weeks of reading our reports. Probably not a good message to send to folks out in BC, but everybody here in Ontario is laughing at that, so that's great. The other area that we focus on is government transformation, and that's where the sharing economy really fits in. How do governments respond and react to societal change, to demographic change, to technological change, given many of the structures and processes we have in place in our municipal, provincial, and federal governments were designed 50 or 100 years ago and haven't really been updated since. So we wrote a report back in February called Policymaking for the Sharing Economy Beyond Whack-A-Mole. It's available on our website. I encourage you to take a look at it. I only have a few minutes to give you an overview, so I'm only going to be touching on some of the key highlights. We also do a lot of work for governments. We're doing a research report for the OECD on tourism and the sharing economy, and we hope to have that out in early 2016. So there's three things I'm going to talk to you about today. So number one, what is the sharing economy? Just some basic definitional issues. Number two, who are some of the key players in the sharing economy? How do we navigate all of those different and varied stakeholders? And number three, what are some smart ways we can move forward in terms of regulating and thinking about the sharing economy as a government and also as citizens and consumers? So what is the sharing economy? What do we mean when we use that term? Heather mentioned this idea of collaborative consumption. That's really central to a lot of what we mean when we refer to the sharing economy. There are really two primary definitions. There are many definitions. There are kind of two that have emerged, I would say, as kind of particularly useful. Sharing economy is really about marketplaces or platforms that in the first instance enable people to connect directly with each other. So peer-to-peer collaborative consumption of goods and services. So rather than me going to a store to buy a good or to procure a service, I can deal with anybody in the audience here in Toronto who's just a regular person like me and say, can you give me a ride somewhere? Do you have a spare room that I could stay in? Do you have a service you could offer me if I need somebody to proofread a paper for me? Maybe somebody here can help me and I can transact directly with them. The second main definition of the sharing economy, we don't hear quite as much about this one necessarily. The first one is really for things like Uber and Airbnb that are kind of occupying all of the attention in the media. The second one is this idea that we're sharing the same asset on a time usage basis. So you probably heard of companies like Zipcar, AutoShare, Bixby Bike. So a company actually owns the product, but they're renting it out on a time use basis to individual people. So I don't need to buy a bike or buy a car. When I need a car, I can go and access that car. So what does the sharing economy actually look like? As I mentioned, Uber and Airbnb are the companies that are getting most of the attention. Uber obviously is in the taxi, the transportation space, Airbnb in the accommodation area. PwC wrote a report last year noting that there are really 5 key sectors for the sharing economy. So they are transportation, retail, accommodation, services, and finance. Together, those 5 services currently are valued at about $15 billion US. That's projected to rise from $15 billion to $335 billion within the next 10 years. So hugely rapid growth. As I mentioned, Uber is the one most people are familiar with, this ride-sharing idea that I can just kind of turn my regular personal car into a taxi, essentially, and carry people around for rides and make some extra money in my spare time. In the accommodation space, many of you have heard of Airbnb. Vacation rental by owner is another example of a company like that, where people can just let out a room or let out their house when they don't feel that they actually need to use it themselves. In the services space, TaskRabbit is a big platform in the United States. So if I have a particular skill, which unfortunately I don't, I looked on TaskRabbit and I couldn't actually do most of the things that people are offering services for. So it's things like party planning, meal preparation, cleaning. My wife would be the first to tell you, I can't actually do any of those things. So if we do move to a much more of a sharing economy model for our economy generally, I think I'm going to be out of luck and I'll just be sitting quietly in the corner writing research reports. So we also have finance, so that's an interesting one. Many of you have probably heard of Indiegogo or Kickstarter. So if you're starting up a restaurant or a company, instead of going to a bank or a commercial lender to try and raise funds or equity for that transaction, you can actually crowdfund that, and a lot of people can give you $5 or $10, and that adds up very quickly if you have thousands of people giving you funding. So is this actually anything really new? Yes and no. In some ways, it's not really that new. For many generations, kind of dating back to the earliest time that people were living in caves and going back and forth, people have always kind of gone to their neighbors or people they know and say, can I borrow this drill? Would you mind if I used your car on the weekend when you're not using it? I have to move my furniture and you have a pickup and I don't have a pickup. But what we've seen in recent years is that there's much less social cohesion particularly in our larger cities. So, I mean, I'm not a particularly friendly person. I don't know many people on my street. I would have no idea who to ask to borrow a drill from, or if I could use somebody's pickup truck or something like that. So the bonds of social cohesion have frayed as our cities have gotten bigger and bigger. The sharing economy steps into that void in some ways, and it's particularly been enabled by technology. The scale of these transactions is much, much larger now. So instead of the 50 or 60 people I might have known 30 years ago to ask to borrow or use a good or service, now there are literally tens of thousands or potentially millions of people around the world that I can transact with. If I'm somebody who makes sweaters or knit sweaters in my spare time, I can sell that sweater to somebody in Australia, somebody in Finland, somebody in Estonia now, thanks to platforms like eBay. So the scale of these transactions, the scale of these markets is much, much bigger now than it ever has been before. And the technology also makes things much easier to do. There's very little friction in an Uber transaction. I pull out my smartphone and I swipe it a couple of times and a car shows up magically at my front door. I don't have to talk to anybody on the phone. Similarly for Airbnb, I can look at a variety of rooms and places to stay in a destination that I'm going. And absolutely fundamental to all of this is the idea of reputational rankings. That is so important for the sharing economy because I rate people who provide me services and people who provide services rate the users of those services. So if I'm in an Uber car, the driver will actually rate me as a passenger and say, Sunil wasn't a very good passenger. He was talking very loudly on his phone and was pretty rude. So that helps build trust and give people faith that the transactions they're going to engage in are going to be trustworthy. If I see somebody's got 5-star ratings for their Airbnb accommodation, I'm much more likely to actually stay there if there are a lot of ratings that are quite good. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind here. And the third point I'd like to make is these companies, by and large, they're harnessing underutilized assets that they do not themselves own. Uber doesn't own a single car. Airbnb doesn't own a single hotel room. And yet their scale of growth has grown very rapidly. So they don't have any capital constraints on their growth because they don't actually own anything really. Their only constraint is regulatory. Can they get governments to agree that they should be allowed to operate in a given jurisdiction? So the scale of growth of these companies has been absolutely incredible. The valuation of Uber, it's 50 billion, it's 60 billion, it's kind of going up by 10 billion every month it seems. When we wrote our report, it was 25 billion 6-7 months ago. Uber adds 40,000 drivers a month in the United States. Airbnb has gone from less than 50,000 people staying in rooms 5 years ago to 17 million people staying in Airbnb rooms the summer of 2015. So 350-fold increase within a 5-year period. So who are some of the key players in the sharing economy? And some of them are fairly obvious. We've got established operators. So we have cab companies like Beck and Co-op here in Toronto. We have hotel chains. We have the big box retailers. Generally speaking, their interest in the sharing economy is not one of great welcome, I would say. Their interest is keeping the market relatively protected. Things are relatively good for them as they stand now. So they don't really want to see these new entrants come into the marketplace. We've also got the platforms and marketplaces themselves. So the Ubers, the Airbnbs, the Etsy's. Their interest is growing their platform as quickly as possible, getting as many people onto the platform as possible so they can conduct these transactions. We've also got entrepreneurs, so the people who are on these platforms providing services. And they look very different depending on what service you're looking at. We can't take a one-size-fits-all approach and say it's just people making incremental dollars on top of a regular job. Sometimes people will give up their job and full-time engage in sharing economy transactions. We've obviously got the consumers. By and large, they're voting with their thumbs and with their feet, and they seem to like the sharing economy. It's much easier to use. They have more choice. Often prices are lower. Then finally, we've got the broader public, and that's the group that we really have to be focused on when we're thinking about this from a government perspective. How do we make policies that are in the broader public interest, not in the interest of established operators or new entrants? So I only have a couple of minutes left, but I just want to talk briefly about how do we move forward, where do we go from here from a policymaking point of view and from a public point of view. To date, the response to the sharing economy in Canada, and for that matter globally, has been very disconnected. We've seen municipalities and various jurisdictions often take a very reactive approach. They're finding these companies, they're trying to shut them down, particularly in the case of the companies like Uber and Airbnb. And in other cases, they're just kind of in this odd gray zone where we're not sure what to do. The people who are engaged in the transactions aren't sure. Am I doing something personal or am I doing something commercial? Where do we draw the boundaries between those types of activities? So we need to address the structure and culture of government, which generally speaking is quite slow-moving and fairly reactive. How do we become more proactive and more nimble? So in terms of some ways forward specifically, performance-based regulation. If we know that somebody's a 5-star rated user on a sharing economy platform, why should we waste a lot of government time checking whether that person is complying with exhaustive regulatory requirements? If the user's happy, if nobody's complaining, let's take a little bit more of a hands-off approach. Another approach is let's use waivers and exemptions. So let's take a step back. Let's not regulate hurriedly. Let's take a pause, watch these new companies in action for a year, and then develop rules that make sense. So really, this is an opportunity to learn. Sharing economy companies are very good at using data. How can we use data better as government? How can we use data better as consumers? How can we make smarter decisions? How can we maximize the value of our assets that aren't being used effectively? And finally, how can we develop more efficient marketplaces? Those are really the three things I would say. If you're to take anything away from the sharing economy, those are the three lessons I would draw out of this. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion from the panel. This really has some significant implications for moving away from ownership models and moving towards models of shared usage, rental usage, and collaborative usage. So thanks for your time, and I look forward to participating in the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Neil.